couple more comments I'll just make about Acts. Again, we're not going to go through any details, but the second missionary journey obviously follows the first missionary journey, but more importantly follows the Council of Jerusalem. And so we see really kind of a expansion significantly in the second missionary journey. The gospel goes into Europe, and we see it going into Philippi, and then Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, Corinth. So we will not talk about each of these letters in correspondence with the city that's talked about. And the reason why is, let me say it this way. When we get and talk about that city, so when we talk about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, I'll make some comments about Paul's time in Thessalonica. But if I do it the other way and kind of follow the missionary journey directly, what happens is that you end up getting the letters out of the sequence in which they were written. And I think there is something to be said about kind of when Paul is writing, where he is and what's going on and why he's writing to the Thessalonians while he's in Corinth, or while he's writing to 1st and 2nd Corinthians when he's in Ephesus and things like that. So we'll talk more about that we'll add that information en route. A couple comments I do want to make, though, is just the beginning. Just a quick comment and observation, really, about Acts 15, where we know that Barnabas and Paul set out with John Mark, and there's a disagreement. And basically, Paul says, I'm going to keep on going, and then you and Barnabas, and you take Mark and deal with the situation. And there's all kinds of questions about what exactly was going on, why, I don't know, is Mark homesick? Is he sick? Is there something going on? Whatever. But there's a lot of discussion about it also because people say that there was this big rift between Paul and Barnabas or between Paul and Mark, and kind of overplay it. And I think what's important is to underscore that as far as priorities go, Paul is always going to make sure that the gospel remains a priority. By asking Barnabas to go back with John Mark, it's clear that he's also taking care of John Mark. I mean, he's not saying to John Mark, whatever's going on here, whatever. So he releases Barnabas to take care of John Mark, his cousin. So it's clear that he cares, and he's kind of dealing with the situation that's before him. But it's also clear that, all things considered, if they've set out to do something, Paul is going to continue and not let circumstances derail the mission. And this is a hard one because sometimes, as I said, sometimes Paul gets kind of bad press for this, and this idea that Paul the Maverick and stuff like that. Just one comment I would say is it seems that Paul made sure that the situation was dealt with in a way that major issues were considered, but it was not of such a magnitude that it would stop him from continuing on with the planned missionary journey. And I guess I would just say it this way, is that in our own context, in ministry, both overseas and in church settings, we often come up with this, where a situation arises and we have to really use wisdom to determine, is this a turn around and get on the next plane, or is this something that we can send somebody home and continue the mission? I mean, this is not an unheard of situation. And so I think it's interesting to just see that, we get this recorded. It's also interesting that at the end of Paul's life in 2 Timothy 4 and Colossians 4, Paul refers to Mark as his son. So, very endearing term. So whatever the issue was, it wasn't a break fellowship, never talk to this Mark guy again. And it just really appears to be a situation that arose. It's recorded, but I think it's recorded to help us see that there are times when we have to make a decision to go forward and to let other issues resolve themselves or let somebody else deal with those issues. In Acts 16 is when we're going to be introduced to Timothy, very important. And so we see Paul kind of in the context of the mission then, rebuilding his mission team on the road. And I mentioned this before, but I do want to just kind of connect the dot back to this. But with all the discussion in Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem, about circumcision as not being a prerequisite to the gospel, many people have also criticized in Acts 16, the very first recorded event is that Paul has Timothy circumcised. And many have pointed that out as being an inconsistency. So that's where we get this idea that we have the Paul of the Pauline epistles and the Paul of Acts. But a couple comments. We've already talked about this, so I'm just reminding us what we talked about before. Clearly, Timothy and his mother and his grandmother are all believers prior to the circumcision. It's quite obvious from the text that Timothy is not circumcised so that he can become a believer. Okay, so that's one thing. Second thing is that we already talked about this, but just to remind ourselves, in the context of having a Jewish mother and being considered Jewish, Timothy not being circumcised would have been a barrier to ministry. So Paul deals with something that's not going to, will then cease that from being a problem with ministry. It's hard to come up with a good analogy for this, but I think I mentioned this before that's kind of helpful. But let's just say, hypothetically, that we had somebody who was coming onto a ministry team, and I really don't have a thing about tattoos. It's just an easy example to use. But let's say somebody comes onto a ministry team, and they have a tattoo that maybe, is pre-Christian tattoo that could be objectionable. And the person that they're ministering with says, you know what, in the context in which we're going to be ministering, it'd probably be a good idea to think about having that removed or covering it or doing something. It has nothing to do with salvation. It has everything to do with anticipating possible barriers or obstacles to sharing the gospel and dealing with them in advance. Okay? So I think that's important to understand, because people often look at the whole discussion in the Council of Jerusalem and then Acts 16 and say, this is totally inconsistent. No, it's not. It's not. And they're really totally different issues. But I think it's impossible to look at Acts 16 and see that somehow the question of Timothy's circumcision has to do with his salvation. So I think that's important to understand, because, again, if we can contextualize and understand some of these bigger pictures in Acts, I think there's a lot of things that we could see that there's ways that that could be contextualized. We have freedom in Christ, but there are times when wisdom says that we would do things that would remove a possible barrier to the gospel. And that's just one way to think about it. Okay, so the second missionary journey, as I said, very important. We have a clear expansion of the gospel into Europe. And then we come back, and there's another account of the gospel, kind of how the highlights of the second missionary journey. Then we have the third missionary journey, and what's important about this is just seeing the extensive time that Paul is going to spend in Ephesus, and then a very touching scene in Ephesus with the Ephesian elders. Actually, they're in Miletus. They come out to the coast in Acts 20. And again, just I think what I love about reading that passage is just the tender affection that Paul has for this group of people. I mean, if you've read about everything that's happened in Ephesus, and then Paul goes over into Greece, and then when he's coming back on his way to Jerusalem, he gets to meet with these people and has a clear indication that it may be the last time he'll see them. That, to me, is also very important insight into Paul. Because sometimes we get, again, this idea that he's this maverick and he's just so visionary and mission-minded that he just doesn't, relate to people. And nothing can be further than the truth. And when you read this really touching account, and again, you really get the sense of being able to look in on a group of people who have ministered together for quite some time, several years, really know each other, love each other, and just the sadness of parting. And I think all of us can relate to that, where we've been in contexts where we have ministered with people. It's hard to get closer to people, I think, than when you minister with them. And you're really side by side praying and working with people and all those things. So I love Acts 20 for that. Acts 21 then is the travel to Jerusalem. While in Jerusalem, Paul is falsely accused of bringing a Gentile into the area of the temple where Gentiles are forbidden. Then we see the rest, if you just even look at my outline, the rest of Acts really focuses on a series of trials where Paul has to defend himself. It's in this context that we see Paul twice sharing his conversion account. A couple of comments I'll make in this overall overview is a couple of the times when Paul appeals to his Roman citizenship. He does that in Philippi. And one of the reasons why he appeals to not being treated unjustly in Philippi is to set a precedent for the gospel. Sometimes people will say, you know, he kind of pulled out his Roman citizenship card so he wouldn't have to suffer. If you know anything about Paul's life, and particularly the account that he gives in 2 Corinthians, Paul was very familiar with suffering and was not afraid to suffer anything for the gospel. But it is clear in Acts 16, where we see that the riot is breaking out in Philippi and Paul appeals to his Roman citizenship, that he be treated as a Roman citizen. That meant that he could not be crucified, he could not be flogged. There were several things that came with being a Roman citizen. It didn't always mean that they were upheld, but appealing to his Roman citizenship would hold the local government accountable. And I think the best way to understand this is that Paul is not saying, hey, I'm trying to get out of something, but instead he's trying to set a precedent to say a person who is a Christian cannot be an exception to the law. In other words, we can't say, oh, here's how Roman citizens are treated except for Christians. The other thing that I think is very helpful is in kind of understanding this is that Paul realizes he's not going to get a fair trial before the Sanhedrin. And as a Roman citizen, he can appeal to Caesar. Now, let's think about our timetable and when Acts is likely written and who is the Caesar at that time. And it's pretty remarkable to think that the Caesar that he's appealing to is Nero, which tells you very clearly that Paul knew he was not going to get a fair trial in the Sanhedrin. Now, in Philippians, Paul says that to die and to be with Christ is better than to live. In other words, to be face-to-face with Jesus is better than anything this side of eternity. So when Paul realizes he's not going to get a fair trial with the Sanhedrin, once again, I don't think we should put that in the category of somehow Paul is afraid to die and he's just trying to make sure, you know, that he's not going to be put to death by the Sanhedrin. No, again, this goes down to a much bigger picture, and every single thing that we see in Paul's life is always understanding it in this larger context. One, he wants a fair trial for all kinds of reasons, but again, I think it has to do with ultimately the precedent that it sets for the church. But also, he's told specifically in a vision by the Lord that he will be able to witness to kings. So here we see that, Paul understanding that even that we can think about it this way. God uses Paul's Roman citizenship as the means to get Paul to the place where he can share the gospel with Nero and the Praetorian Guard. So I just want to point out some of those things because those are some of the more difficult to understand, or things that are often commented or questioned on in Acts. And yet what we can see is a consistency of really seeing how Paul makes the gospel the priority always, whether that has to do with interpersonal conflict that will eventually get resolved and it's not going to derail the mission, whether that's appealing to his legal rights to set a precedent for the church, you know, any of these different ways that we could think about it.